Ephesians chapter 6 this morning. This sermon is for everyone. We have thousands of college students that are not parents as of yet. But it's important that you make decisions now on how you're going to train your children. We have many parents. It's imperative that we train our children according to God's Word. We have many grandparents. Grandparents, your job has not ended just because your children are out of your household. You have a role as a grandparent to help your children in the training of their children. And you must do your part. The future of our world rests on the backs of our children. And very literally, the job we do as parents will determine what our world 20, 40, 60 years from now will look at. Parent, this idea of I'm just going to let my kids grow up and I'm here to provide for their physical needs. If that's all you think parenting is, you're missing out on what parenting is all about. And you see, there is no way whatsoever children can turn out right, turn out godly, without proper influence from their parents. Our children living in this day and age have great problems. But I'm here to say the reason our children have so many problems so many times is because our parents are not doing their job as God has instructed us to do. And we're destroying our future by not training and raising our children as they should. This morning I want you to see 3 Bible principles about parenting. The sermon entitled this morning, A Portrait of Proper Parents. This morning, I'm not giving you Neal Jackson's philosophy on parenting. I'm giving you God's philosophy on parenting, found from these few verses that we're going to look at. And God has definite instructions for every parent about the raising of their children. 3 Bible principles about parenting. The first one is this: what parents should require of their children. What every parent should require of their children. And there's 2 things. First of all, in verse 1, we are to require obedience. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Obey is a compound Greek word. It means to hear under. It refers to somebody who hears under the authority of another. Obey is a military term. It was used to describe a soldier who follows orders. And very simply, every child that is born into every family is to obey their parents, to follow the orders, the directives of their parents. Any good soldier is obedient to his masters. And any good child should be obedient to his parents. And mom and dad, who's going to teach your children obedience? It is your job to require obedience in the home. The first lesson you should teach your child is the lesson of obedience. But understand, obedience does not come natural. Your child is not just going to come out of the womb obeying. No, they tend toward disobedience. If you're a young parent, children will not obey on their own. They must be trained to obey. Psalm 58, verse 3. The wicked are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. Now listen, you see these beautiful, beautiful babies. They're not just going to turn out right. They have to be trained and they have to be taught what is right. They have to be led in the right ways. Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. If you don't train your child in the way he should go, he will naturally go in the way he should not go. See, children must understand from the time that they are born, obedience is not an option in our household. Obedience is an obligation, and it is a requirement. Quite honestly, it bothers me when I'm out at the mall or I'm at the grocery store, or even worse, when I'm at a church function and a parent will tell their child to do something and the child will say, "No, I don't want to do that." I'm thinking, who's the parent here? Who is supposed to give the rules, and the children are supposed to obey? They're supposed to follow the teaching, the directives of the family. Look on in verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Kids just don't obey for the parent's sake. They're to obey for God's sake. And see, when a parent doesn't require obedience, you're teaching your children, you're permitting your children to not only rebel against you, the parent, but to be disrespectful and to rebel against God. The basis of obedience, the motivation for all obedience, is to please God. The reason citizens should obey police is ultimately to please God. The reason ultimately that employees should obey the boss is to please God. The reason students should obey teachers to please God. And the reason children should obey their parents ultimately is to please God. So Mom, when you do not require your children to obey you, Dad, when you do not require your children to obey you, you are hurting their view of God. It's not just, oh, well, it's not that big a deal. It is a big deal. Do you realize that everything in this universe is built upon obedience? The planets, the stars, they're obedient. The sea, the animal life, they're obedient. The birds, the animals, the trees, the flowers, they're all obedient. Our whole universe is built upon obedience to God. The only part of the universe that is not obedient is humanity. And we're rebellious, and when we allow that in our home, we're doing damage to our children. The best example I've ever seen of this, we had dinner several months ago with the Richardsons. They have a dog there, I don't know, I think it's a German Shepherd. And Mr. Richardson brought out this little treat, and we've already had dinner. He places it right there in front of the dog. And he says, "Sit, stay." And then he comes over and sits down, and we're just talking. He's ignoring the dog. We're talking on and on and on. The dog, with a little treat right in front of it, has its eyes fixed on Mr. Richardson, just watching intently. We're talking and talking and talking, and I'm amazed at this dog. Finally, he looks over at the dog and says, "All right, you can have it." And boom, it's gone. My response, "Can you take my kids for a couple weeks?" Parents, we are to train our children in obedience. We are to require obedience in the home. It's not an option. It should be a requirement in every home. Secondly, not only should require obedience, we should require respect. Notice verse 2. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Now, there's a difference between obeying your parents and honoring your parents. Obedience is outward. Honor is inward. Obedience is an action. Honor is an attitude. It is possible for your child to be obedient, but not to be respectful, not to honor you. I can tell David, "David, go take the garbage to the dump." David can obey me by taking the garbage to the dump, but he can dishonor me, be disrespectful by mouthing all the way to the dump. We are to require obedience, but we're to require respect. Honor means to respect, to revere, to hold in high regard. And children should have respect for their parents. They should never talk back to their parents. They should never be permitted to talk back to their parents or to down their parents to their friends. That's not respectful. And parents, when you allow that in your home, you're hurting your child's view of God. You are teaching them how they are to respond to God by teaching how they're to act in the home. Why? Because it's important that you respect and honor your parents, because that's going to correlate to how you view God. What should be required in every home? obedience. What should be required in every home? Respect. Why should we require obedience and respect in the home? Let me give you 3 reasons. First reason, because it's right. Look at verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. In this day and age of outcome-based education, of political correctness, of relativism, of values clarification, let me go on record as saying there is absolute truth, and there is a right, and there is a wrong, and it is right for children to obey their parents. And it is wrong when children don't obey their parents. The primary responsibility for teaching right and wrong is not at school. It's not at church. The primary responsibility for teaching obedience is in the home. You see, we at the church inherit what you do in the home, and they at the school inherit what you do in the home. The number one reason you should require obedience in your home is because it's right. If you do not require obedience in your home, pardon me, but you're wrong. And you're failing your children. You're hurting your children. Why should you require respect and obedience? Because it's right. Second reason, because it's required. Notice verse 2. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first, say that next word with me, commandment. Obedience and respect is a command from God. The same way, thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt honor your father and mother. You should require obedience and respect in the home. A recent study identified parental priorities of people all over the world. They did this great survey, and they wanted to know what parents' greatest desire was for their children. The people in Europe said our greatest desire, their number one answer, was good health for their children. The people in Japan said our greatest desire for our children is success. The number one answer for Americans, their greatest desire for their children, is that their children be happy. Do you understand how wrong that is? Now, I'm not against happiness, but when that is greater than your child's character, then you're headed toward disaster. God's greatest desire for your child is not that your child be happy. God's greatest desire for your child is that your child be holy. And that's a requirement for you, Mom and Dad, to require obedience, to require respect. Because when you require obedience and respect, you are teaching them to obey and respect God. And to turn that around, when you don't require obedience and when you don't require respect, you're teaching them, well, you don't have to obey and respect anyone, and that includes God. So when you allow Junior to say, no, I'm not going to do that, ultimately, yeah, you're hurting our world, but you're hurting your child's view of God. It's right for you to require respect and obedience. It's required. Thirdly, it's rewarded. Notice verse 2 again. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment. Notice the last two words. With promise. Notice verse 3. That it may be well with thee and thou mayest live long on the earth. God honors children who honor their parents. You say, why? Because if a child will listen to godly parents, he will escape a lot of sin and a lot of suffering. Now, let me just give you a thought. If your child does not obey and respect you at 2 and at 4 and at 6, nothing is going to change when they get to be 12 and 14 and 16. Mom and Dad, the reason you must require obedience and respect in the early years is because you're preparing them for the rest of their lives. And there's going to be so much heartache if you don't require obedience and respect in those early years. D.L. Moody said, I have lived over 60 years, and I have learned one thing if I have learned nothing else. No man or woman who dishonors father and mother ever prospers. When you don't demand obedience and respect, you're hurting your children in life. When you tolerate rebellion, you really are abusing your child. But notice what the verse says again. Promises a quality of life, that it may be well with thee. Promises a quantity of life, and that thou mayest live long on the earth. Why? Because you have taught, you have trained your children to be obedient, to be respectful, and in a very real sense, you've prepared them for life. What parents should require of their children. Secondly, I want you to notice how parents should respond to their children. See, it's not enough just to teach them the right message. You must teach them in the right manner. Notice verse 4. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Now, Paul here addresses the fathers because the father is to be the head of the home, but it's applicable to both mom and dad, both to the father and the mother. Provoke, this word says. It says, don't exasperate them. Don't frustrate them. Don't antagonize them by using your authority deliberately just to exasperate them, to put them at their wits' end. Now, this teaching in this time period was a totally new concept. You see, most of the families in Paul's day, they were experiencing wrecked homes, and their homes were in shambles. According to the Roman law of patria potestas, a father had absolute authority over his children. If he wanted to throw his children out of his home, he could do that for any reason he wanted to. If he wanted to sell his children into slavery, he could do that. It was his prerogative. Paul's writing to fathers, but also to parents. He says, hey, Dad, you're to love your children. You're not against them. You're to train them up. You're to point them in the right direction. They are very literally your posterity, and they're going to carry your name. You're not against them. You're not to exasperate them. You're not to antagonize them. You're to love and encourage them. Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. Hey, Dad, you're raising a family, not an army. You're to be a dad, not a drill sergeant. And that's what these two verses say. We're not to provoke them to wrath, lest they be discouraged. You can either beat down your children, or you can lift up your children. You can encourage your children. You can discourage them, or you can put them down. You can tear them down, or you can build them up by encouraging them. And the fact is, children living in this day and age, they need encouragement. Just like a plant needs water every day, your child needs encouragement day after day after day after day after day. You should go and follow up on your children, and you should try to catch them doing right. And praise them for it. Say, that is great. That is wonderful. You are such a great son or a great daughter. I am so proud of you. You should catch your children doing right and encourage them in doing it. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 21. The wise in heart shall be called prudent, and the sweetness of the lips increases learning. See, the way you teach is just as important as what you teach. You can teach your children one or two ways. You can be harsh, you can yell, you can scream, you can always be tearing them down, or you can teach them by being positive, by being encouraging to them, by showing them that you're on the same team and your whole goal in life is to see them succeed in life. Dad, Mom, we need you to, for the sake of your kids, to love them to right. Stand against wrong, yes. Tell them what is wrong, yes. But tell them why it's wrong. Point them in the right direction. Model what a Christian should live. One author put it like this: 5 ways parents damage their children. I'll give them to you quickly. First of all, by not admitting when they're wrong. You know, your children, they see when you make mistakes. Your children see when you fly off the handle and get upset. And when you don't admit it to them and ask them to forgive you, you're teaching them, oh, you don't have to admit when you're wrong. Second way we damage our children is by failure to allow kids to have their personal identity. So many times, Dad, just because you were great at basketball doesn't mean your child's going to be. Just because you were a straight A 4.0 student, maybe one of your children won't be like that. Let them have a personal identity within boundaries. Thirdly, failure to communicate approval and acceptance. Your children need your acceptance. And if you don't give it to them, they will go throughout life trying to find acceptance. Dave Simmons was a linebacker for Georgia Tech in 1962 to 1964. He always felt he could never meet up to his dad's expectations. He was always trying. He was a great football player, but yet he never felt he could meet up to Dad's expectations. He was in the Senior Bowl. He was co-captain of the South team. At the end of the game, had a great game, called his dad. His dad said, hey, at halftime they interviewed the linebacker for the North team, Dick Butkus. Why didn't they interview you? If you would have done a little bit better, maybe you would have been interviewed. He said, my heart was broken. Dave Simmons was drafted, the NFL, by St. Louis in the 2nd round. Called his dad. Dad said, you know what, that's great, son. If you would have tried a little bit harder, you might have been able to make the 1st round. Maybe St. Louis would have drafted you 1st round instead of old Joe Namath. This is what Dave writes in his own words. To this day, I can't capture the feeling of a job well done. I constantly focus on my mistakes and am negative toward all that I do. I set goals too high and fail. I go to ridiculous lengths to reach perfection in order to get compliments and recognition for my work. But then I can't appreciate acceptance that I get. And it all started, and it starts so many times when your children don't get acceptance from Mom and Dad. 4th way we damage our children is failure to give them the right to fail. Listen, they're going to make mistakes. And when they do, it's time to help them up, learn from those lessons, and go forward. 4th, by failure to take time with your children. Several years ago, Ken Griffey chose not to go to the Player's Choice Award. He was to receive the Player of the Decade Award, and this was a huge award. He beat out Barry Bonds, who was a 3-time MVP. He beat out Greg Maddux, who was a 4-time Cy Young Award winner. This was the Player of the Decade. This was a big deal. Ty Cobb had won this. Babe Ruth had won this. Mickey Mantle had won this. Pete Rose had won this. Mike Schmidt had won this. This was a very big deal. Someone asked him, Griffey, Player of the Decade, why are you not going to receive this award? This is what he said. Trey, my 5-year-old son, has his first baseball game. I'm a whole lot more interested in being a father than being a baseball player. And Dad, your kids need you. Mom, your children need you there. Very literally, the future of our world is dependent upon how well of a job we do as parents. What parents should require of their children, how parents should respond to their children. Thirdly, I want you to notice what parents should reflect before their children. Now you're in verse 4, notice it again. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up, and notice that next word, in. It carries the idea of an environment, of a culture, of a surrounding. Literally, we are to bring up our children in a home, in an environment, in a setting where Christianity is modeled before them. Parents, you're not just to tell your children how to live, you're to show them how to live. You're to show them that you love God's Word. You're to show them that you love church. You're to show them that you love singing praises to the Lord. The way we get our children to accept our faith is by living a true Christian faith before them. So how do you teach your children the things of God? Let me give you 2 ways that we do that from here in this verse. 1, we're to discipline our children when they're wrong. Now notice the verse again. But bring them up in the nurture. That word nurture, it's paideia in the Greek, used 6 times in your King James Bible. 4 times it refers to chastening or to chastisement. Carries the idea that you are to discipline your children when they do wrong. Very literally, discipline is a mark of love. Discipline is something you do for your child, not to your child. And quite honestly, a little discipline in life early on will save you a whole lot of heartache in those later teenage years. And to be a little bit more blunt, if you don't discipline your children will go in the wrong direction. Proverbs 22, verse 15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. God is our best example of this. No one in life loves you more than God does. But no one is more clear in setting out clear guidelines and clear boundaries and disciplining us when we do what's wrong. So you can't say, well, I love my children too much to discipline them. No, that's not true. If you don't love your children enough to discipline them, if you don't love your children enough to make them honor and respect and obey you, if you allow your children just to do their own thing, quite honestly, you don't love your children. Proverbs 13, verse 24. He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes, over and over and over again. Very simply, and you know this statement, you spare the rod and you will spoil your child. Second way we bring up our children, you should direct your children to what is right. Now look on in the verse. But bring them up in the nurture and admonition. Admonition has the idea of instruction, has the idea of teaching, has the idea of direction, has the idea of encouragement. You are to exhort your children. You are to train your children. You are to lead your children in the way that they should go. If you're going to train them, you're going to have to spend time with them. Do you realize that the average 5-year-old spends 25 minutes a week interacting one-on-one with Dad? That's 3.5 minutes a day. That same child spends 25 hours a week watching television. And you wonder where our children are getting their morals, where they're getting their values? Look at the verse one last time. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition, last 3 words, of the Lord. It's not enough to put a roof over your child's head. You must put the Lord in your child's heart. You must do everything you possibly can to see that your child loves Jesus. It's not enough to make sure they're physically fed and all of their physical needs are fed. You must make sure they are spiritually fed. You must do everything you can to make sure your children are taken care of spiritually. Parents, to succeed at parenting, you must direct your kids spiritually. April 18th, 1775. Paul Revere went through our young nation declaring, hey, there's an enemy coming, there's an enemy coming. Let's wake up, let's wake up, let's get prepared to fight. As a preacher today, I come before you concerned about the future of our country. But quite honestly, the future of our country is not so much dependent upon the White House as it is dependent upon your house and my house. You see, we change the country, we change the world by changing our homes. Parents, we need you to recommit your life to raising up your children to love God. That's more important than you seeing that they have the best clothes or the best car or the best gadget. Your number one responsibility as a parent is the spiritual well-being of your child. A teacher called home and asked specifically to speak to the father. The father worked 2 jobs and was incredibly busy. Dad finally called the teacher back, and the teacher says, Dad, can you come in? I'd like to talk to you one-on-one. Well, the dad was a little perturbed. Usually Mom took care of the visits to the teacher, but this time Dad went to meet with the teacher. He walked in, he sat down, just a little miffed because he's trying to provide for the physical well-being of his family. Teacher says, I asked all of the children in my class to draw a picture of their family. I wanted you to see what your daughter drew. Showed them the picture. Picture of Mom. There was a picture of the daughter, a picture of her 2 brothers. The dad says, well, where am I? The teacher says, that's why I called you in. I asked your daughter, well, where's your dad? The daughter said, my dad's never at home, so I didn't include him in our picture. Mom, Dad, you get one chance at parenting. For the sake of your kids, for the sake of our future, don't fail your kids.